Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning. All right, folks, welcome back to the Flatirons Syndicate Podcast. Here in the shop again today, answering more of your questions. So, on our YouTube channel, the last question that I put out was, if you guys had any questions about our Pikes Peak car or running the Pikes Peak Hill Climb, and you guys sent in a bunch of good questions. And so that is what I'm going to go through today. And one of our YouTube members sent another good question in. So maybe by the time you're watching this, the next question that we're going to answer is up there. So keep your eyes up on our YouTube channel for more of these. Like going through all these questions, it's actually great to see what you guys are wondering about, so we can just talk about them. I really like the format of this, so we're definitely going to keep doing it and doing more of these. So, without further ado, right at the top, there's two questions that were pretty similar. One is from Stamdar1, which was, what are the most impactful changes to the suspension? Thoughts on different chassis reinforcement products from companies like Cusco? How did the cage change the handling? And what areas do you think a non-caged car would benefit from the most from reinforcement? And then Robert Doran, 2164, interested to know if we've done anything to stiffen the chassis, for example, seam welding or other bracing. So obviously the car has a roll cage in it. When we had the cage put in, Pikes Peak had some pretty specific rules as far as the support. So there was a couple extra support beams, especially in the halo, up over the driver's head, that they required. So obviously we did all of that, and Pikes Peak did not have any rules against gusseting to the cage. So with a 6-point cage, there's basically 6 points of contact. So A pillars, kind of the pillars that go on the other side of your windshield and down to the floor of the chassis. So that's 2. B pillars, behind the driver's seat into the middle of the car. That's 4, and then C pillars basically to the back. That's 6. And so what we did is we gusseted the A pillars and the B pillars. So the cage ties directly into those. Plus we have a lot of X bracing in the B pillars, so that supports the driver's harnesses. That's required. And then back into the C pillar, that goes around where suspension goes into the car. So the short answer is, by putting the cage in the car, that pretty much did all of the chassis stiffening that we really needed to, because we were able to gusset to all of those parts of the cage in that way. There are some classes out there in motorsports where you are not allowed to gusset to the cage. It just depends on the class. If you have a cage installed and you're not able to gusset to it, then you don't get as much benefits for chassis stiffness just by putting in a cage. Though you still get a fair amount, just by merit of the fact that now, with harnesses, if you're in the driver's seat, you want the harness to connect as close behind your shoulders as possible, or as is reasonable. And so because of that, you're going to have the main hoop and the B pillars, and you're going to have the harness braces that go across, and usually an X brace. And so that amount of bracing in the center of the car does a lot. And then just if you can follow that up with gusseting into the car. With A pillars, for instance, if you could actually go forward to the strut tops, that's even better. And then connect to the knee bar, so you've got a lot of support up front. If you're putting in a cage, usually, especially if you can gusset to it, that's going to give you all the chassis stiffness that you need. So to specifically answer the question, did we seam weld? No. To seam weld the car is challenging once... Like if you're starting with used car, and if you remember, our car started out as a flood car, so it was underwater for 2 weeks. It is just caked with like mud and stuff down there in those little seams. So it would be really challenging to weld there. But certainly you could pick up some benefits there. So for a car that doesn't have a cage in it, can you see benefits for putting in chassis bracing? The answer is definitely, but you want to be strategic with it. And it's tough because you want to be strategic because you're adding weight. So you're adding stiffness, but with the penalty of weight. And so you definitely want to make sure that any bracing that you're adding in is going in a place where there really is an issue with flex, and you're not paying too much of a weight penalty for it. So like for our car, for a GR chassis, there's probably going to be a pretty minimal benefit for a strut tower bar. This is the case for most Subarus because the strut tops are right up against the rear firewall. There's just not that much more that you can get as far as chassis stiffness. There's going to be a little bit, but it's not going to be huge compared to like if you look at other cars where you've got the strut tops are in the middle of the hood and there's no support, like an S2000, for instance. If you Google an S2000 front struts, I mean, they're literally right in the middle of the hood, and that there's a huge benefit for a strut tower bar there. On a GR chassis with the multi-link rears, there's no benefit for a rear strut bar because the rear struts, the strut tops, they're not really integral into the to the rear suspension because it's multi-link. It's not a McPherson. So that would not be something I would recommend. There are some lower chassis braces. Anything that connects the mounting points of the rear mounting points of the control arms, because there's basically just a pin that comes down. Anything you can do to shore that up, that's going to make a difference. The STI actually got some support back there. That makes a difference. Anything you can do on the front, like a front ladder bar to connect basically the front and rear mounting points for the lower control arms, that helps because you hit a bump, you get an impact. Those loads can cause little deflections. So that would be where it would make sense. Really, you want to kind of try and pinpoint spots on the chassis where there is, flex. You might be able to get a sense of this by just putting the car up, on a jack, or when you jack the car up, especially if you're jacking up on the pinch weld or something like that. Say you're going to maybe see like how much chassis flex there is, and so something like those center braces. That might help reduce chassis flex a bit. You really just want to try and figure out where the chassis is flexing and try and like put some strategic bracing in there. So hopefully that helps answer the question. The GD chassis is more flexible than the GR chassis. It's like every body style Subaru makes it, usually it's something like 30 to 50% stiffer at each increment. So like if you have a GC and then you get into like a 2021 or even a 2022 WRX, the GC is going to feel like a wet noodle compared to the newest of the chassis because they've done so much with the chassis bracing, and the unibody itself is just so much stronger and stiffer than it was in the older chassis. So the older the car that you have, the more you're going to want probably to consider like putting in some strategic bracing. Also worth mentioning is that like if you have a GC or a GD with the McPherson rears, that's where a strut bar can help. Helps a lot with the wagons actually, because the wagon doesn't have the rear firewall, and so there's more flex there in the wagon than in the sedan. Can still make a difference in the sedan, but if you can get like an X brace where you really locate the strut tops, to the floor of the trunk in the sedans, that makes a big difference too. So again, it's just being strategic with where you can put the bracing to minimize any kind of movement of the suspension components. That's kind of first and foremost, because the more you can isolate the suspension components so that they're not deflecting and you're letting them really do their job properly, that's where you're going to get consistent performance, from the suspension, and the car is just going to feel a lot more predictable and just feel a lot more solid. So, if you got more questions about that, definitely let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer in detail in the future. Next question, slip-in sideways 240SX. Awesome. How does the suspension react to the elevation change, being that they're pressurized? Do tire pressures have an effect with elevation as well as you're racing on Pikes Peak? Great question. From our experience, the elevation does not have an effect on the suspension valving itself. And I would guess because, suspension is pressurized, pretty highly, and, the change in atmospheric pressure relative to the pressure in a strut, I think is a small enough percentage that you don't really see anything. Does it affect the tires? Absolutely. This is something that we've struggled with, and you might have heard mention in the podcast with Harvey on data. Now that we've got the Haltech, there is something with Haltech where we were actually able to load temperature and pressure sensors on the valve stem caps. And for a while in practice, we were getting good data, but of course, by Murphy's Law, when we really wanted the data the most on race day, they didn't work, and so we don't actually have any data from going up. Where that was really helpful is, so we are still using air to fill the tires. A lot of the big guys and Pikes Peak use nitrogen because nitrogen does not change as much from either atmospheric pressure or from temperature especially. And the hard part with the temperature side of things is, you're testing all week long in first light. So a lot of times, especially on the top, it can be 30 degrees. It can be super, super cold for a good chunk of the time you're able to test. Then come race day, you run in the middle of the day and it's 85, 90 degrees. Massively different temperatures. The tarmac is going to be significantly hotter than it was at any point when you're in practice. So the tires get hotter and your pressures can spike. We typically try and measure our hot temperatures or pressures when the tires are hot as best we can. But obviously, with the car going up, and Scott drives and he has to sit there for 20, 30 minutes and then come back down, that makes it challenging. That's where the data from the Haltech in real time, being able to see at the end of a run at the top, okay, 4 minutes in, this is what the pressures were like. And so when we set the tire pressures for race day, we use that data to kind of make that estimate. And again, we did not have any issues with the car feeling like it was slick or greasy or anything like that. So I think maybe we got it more right than we have in the past. But of course, I just wish we would have had the data to know. It is something that you really have to watch. Even if you're just tracking the car, it's something you want to set your tire pressures, go out there, get the car hot, come in, check the hot pressures. Definitely check it when you come back to the pits. You don't want to overpressurize the tires. You can basically reduce contact patch. The car can feel like it's sliding more. So yeah, tire pressure is a really big factor, and it's definitely one of the harder pieces of the puzzle to nail on Pikes Peak, just because it's so challenging to test with temperature and then with that elevation. Because as you go up in elevation, the tires are going to expand and the pressure is going to increase. So something that we're still working on, but hopefully if we can figure out those sensors next year, we'll get a lot of good data. And I'm sure that's what all the big guys are doing, is they're looking at all of that. Okay, next question. This one, there's a couple related, so I'm going to answer this question specifically. Jackie Marley Young asked, what caused the failure for the original Type RA motor? There's a few of you with Type RA engines that were very curious about the failure that we had. I'm going to answer this in literally the first Type RA motor that we put in. So the car started life as a 2014 WRX, and we ran for the first 5 years, I think it was 5 years, with the original Sharp Block, the 255 in the car. The failure of that engine was a bearing failure, and that's the only bearing failure that we've had. And it had, I want to say, 3,500 miles on it at that point. Pretty much all of those were, race miles or track testing, almost entirely race use. And that was with the stock oiling system, stock 10 millimeter pump. And most of that time was spent also with, believe it or not, no AOS. I think at the end we had put on the IAG Competition Series AOS of that first engine, but that actually might have come on the second engine. Every other failure that we've had has been down to overheating. We've replaced the head gaskets a couple of times just because we overheated on race day and didn't have a catastrophic failure. But every catastrophic failure that we've had is down to basically overheating and the cooling system having failed. The worst of which was where we, again, had a hose or a clamp fail and dumped all the coolant when we were qualifying a couple of years ago. Or maybe it's just on the bottom section. But yeah, basically completely torched the engine, and that was because we ran it for 4 minutes with no coolant. Do not advise a random air-cooled conversion. And then just, at COTA, it overheated, just overheating. That's it. We've never had a ringland failure, and ever since that first engine, the stock engine, had the bearing failure, we've never had a bearing failure. We do have a couple of sharp blocks and long blocks that we need to tear through that overheated, just kind of see what the state of the bearings were. But we've had so many challenges in terms of cooling with this car, and Pikes Peak is such a unique environment with just the elevation and the lack of air density, just having no air to get over the radiators to keep the car cool. And then just also all the challenges that we had with the radiator cap scenarios and all that sort of other things. We've just really always struggled to keep the car cool on race day. So really, it's just overheating is the answer, and I attribute that to the environment that we're running in. So then, PAB 3783 asked, what caused the engine failure? I'd like to hear their comments, and what did we do to address the risk? What head studs did we use? And he's asking if it's still the same turbo as the setup we discussed when we switched to E85, which is the Turbodynamics MDX 450. I'll answer that first. Yes, still the same turbo. Still running the MDX 450. Head studs, we use the Roger Clark 11mm Extremes in putting the car back together to run up Pikes Peak this year. And usually that we've used ARP 2000s and the Roger Clark 11mm Extremes. The Roger Clark 11mm Extremes are roughly equivalent to the ARP 625s, but in some testing the Roger Clark did, benchmarking the 625s, their 11mm Extreme did outperform it. It is a different alloy. The Roger Clark head studs are not made by ARP. They do use, in some of them, they use ARP fasteners, the nuts, but the studs themselves are completely, they're not made by ARP, and all of the Roger Clark studs are different alloys compared to what ARP uses. What do we do to address the risk? Honestly, there was no time, and so really it was, if you watch the podcast where we talk over with Harvey, going over the data, it was really kind of trying to monitor and keep an eye on it. So we pretty much put it back together, verified that it was running properly, looked at the data, made sure that everything was as good as possible, and just monitor the data. That's what we did to try and reduce the risk of another failure. And you can kind of see that there's probably some issues that cropped up in the run, and that's something that we're now going to have to address going forward. But yeah, with such little time, there just was not a whole lot that could be done differently. And at this point, we've done, darn near everything that I could think of to try and keep the oil pressure, the oil temp, the coolant temps in check. And so kind of, we're going to have to take more steps going forward, and that will be for a future video. This is a really good one. Jerome Tipton, 7954. How do you deal with the car, or with the turbo getting less air at the top of the mountain? So this is a challenging one. So again, air density. You're starting off low. The start line of Pikes Peak is 9,000 feet, and it just gets lower as you go up. Anybody in Colorado, if you've ever been to the top of a mountain that is, say, 10,000 feet, much less 14,000 feet of Pikes Peak, you just start walking around and moving, and you will detect immediately that there's less air there than what you're used to, because you will be short of breath doing something that seems just completely pedestrian, like going upstairs or whatnot. That's your body telling you, hey, there's less oxygen up here. Well, the car feels that same thing, those same issues, but it manifests in different ways, in lack of power, because you can't burn as much fuel because there's not as much air up there. Lack of cooling, like we talked about, there's just not the density of air molecules to go over your radiators and stuff to keep everything cool is just much, much less than what it is at even here where we are at 5,000 feet, much less sea level. But so the turbo has a harder time packing air in to help the engine make power. And what that does is it forces it out of its efficiency range. So what we have done in the past was we would kind of tweak the wastegate duty cycle to increase boost pressure a bit, to try and balance for the loss of power that we would gain, or loss of power that we would run into going up the mountain, to various different degrees of success. So if you saw, and I'll try and put up a picture here, what we did with the Haltech this year is we just kind of try to get it to maintain a standard duty cycle, which ended up giving us only about 18 pounds of boost peak, which is lower than we were tuned for. So we were compared to what we were down here, we were down on power, I guess probably 15%. I think we were well under 400 horsepower for our actual race run. But even with that, probably towards the top, the intercooler got so hot it actually melted, probably a section of bumper 4 inches long, where we're closest to the bumper. So even however much boost we were making, probably at the top, we were past the bell curve, and so we were actually just creating heat and not pressure. So that's something that in the process of kind of evaluating evaluating everything with the engine, figuring out what our next step is, changing the turbo package to find something where we can be more efficient with the less air density that we have, middle to top of the run, and make more power. I think that's one of the things that's on our agenda. The thing why this is a really good question, and it's worth mentioning here, is that there's not a one-to-one relationship between boost pressure and power. Something that it's easy to overlook. It's actually a bell curve relationship. So like initially there's not a whole bunch of increase, then you get a lot of increase, and then there's actually a tipping point where you start to run out of the turbo's efficiency range, where you can add more boost pressure, but the power actually goes down. And the reason is, once you run out of the turbo's efficiency range, it's not packing usable air into the inlet charge anymore. What it's doing is it's heating up the inlet charge because it's out of its efficiency range, and there's so much more friction that's going on. And so the pressure increase is actually coming from heat. You're heating up the charge. It's not because there's more usable air in the charge. And that's when your power starts to go down. And that's where if you push a turbo way out of its efficiency range, you could make, if we were at 18, we could have made 24 pounds at the top, but that inlet charge is probably going to be so hot that we run a real risk, or almost maybe be guaranteed, of having issues with detonation, that sort of thing. So it becomes a lot riskier to push a turbo out of its efficiency range. And that's one of the balances with running a turbocharged car at Pikes Peak, where the change in elevation is changing so much. So you've got to kind of figure out a way to balance that. The optimal way to do that is to monitor compressor wheel speed, and that's something that we're kind of considering, because then there are some turbos like the new Garrett G series that are way more efficient, which is great, but they also have a lot more of a penalty if you overspin them. You can actually break the turbo if you spin it too fast. And when you get up in elevation and the air density goes down, that's one of the things you can kind of easily do. And that's where you have to watch the compressor wheel speed to make sure that you're keeping it within its efficiency range and its sweet spot, and don't spin it too fast, because then you can grenade and that sort of thing. So what we're considering is using a turbo that has the ability to monitor compressor speed, and then putting that into the Haltech and trying to tune boost pressure based on that. It's just a much better, kind of safer way to control boost pressure when you're going through that much of a change in elevation and air density. Or you can use multiple maps. That's another option too. Okay, last couple here. Some Xander Kid, 1827, says that the car made record time on a stock EJ block. Are there any plans to upgrade the internals, and if so, which ones? Short answer is yes. What I think we've kind of come to the conclusion of is that it's time. It's time to upgrade. We're going to make some changes, and to a certain extent, I'm strongly starting to suspect some of the issues that we're having, especially in terms of oil pressure, boil down to the fact that we're using a stock short block, like 100% stock, just right out of the box from Subaru. And so that's where we're going to a built engine. I think it's time, because there's some changes, some differences in construction and whatnot, where it can actually help us with some of these issues that we're having to some extent. And that's where we've got to figure out what we're doing, put it in the car, and then test it and find out to what degree we're seeing an improvement in cooling and maybe oil pressure. So which one? Well, we pretty much know, but I'm gonna keep that in my pocket for right now. But stay tuned. We'll get more into that here soon. Alexanov, next question here. So how do you address the oil? How do you address the oil sloshing going into the breathers when driving on a high incline, decline, or when subjecting the car to high lateral G-forces, like steering up and down hill, that sort of thing? Great question. We've covered this a bit in our dry sump videos, but kind of like what I talked about in the beginning, how the progression of the car. Really, the first couple of years, like the first year especially, it was literally just to see, is the car in a good enough shape that it would make it to the top? Can we keep the car reliable and make it to the top? That was really the question. So we did that without really changing much of anything. So it was basically stock everything. It was only later that we moved to the air oil separator, and then now to the dry sump. And keep in mind, in this whole time, we only had the one bearing failure after running multiple years on that original engine. Though we were much slower, lower power, didn't have as much grip as we have now, that sort of thing. So the best way I can answer that is, first monitor your oil pressure. Like if you think you might be having an issue, getting some data about whether or not you're having an issue and the degree to which you are having an issue is critical. I mean, that's where we still kind of had a bit of an issue this year, but we now know what that is in context because we have the data to go back and look at. So, getting an oil pressure gauge even if you just videotape the gauge and can overlay the oil pressure with what you're doing on track, that sort of thing. Some of these new data logging softwares that lets you kind of log a sensor data with track position. That's a huge first step. Is just knowing what you're dealing with. The faster you go, the more grip you have, the greater chance that you're going to have issues with oil sloshing in the pan. The getting the pressure data is going to tell you how much of an issue that you have, and then you can also, once you have that baseline, then you'll know how much you're improving it by putting in things to change. The biggest ones would be like an air oil separator, because when you have a lot of oil sloshing or when the engine oil is getting really hot, that sort of thing, you're going to have more oil moving through the PCV system. So an air oil separator to try and make sure that any of the oil that gets sent into the PCV system is going to be captured and sent back into the sump. That's big step number one. And then baffling for the oil pan, to try and keep the oil over the pickup, keep the pickup submerged, minimize the amount of oil that's going to slosh out of the pan. Those are the two biggest initial things that you can do. We just put out a video talking about oil pans like Roger Clark. Group N pan is a great option with basically a stock pan, just with way better baffling inside. IAG Street or Competition Series, Killer B Super G, all have really good baffling inside the pan to try and keep the oil from moving around. So those would be the next things to do. And then for us, we went, realizing that we wanted to take those problems out of the equation as much as possible. That's where we now are running a dry sump, because the dry sump eliminates the PCV system, basically. So there's really no issue with sloshing around anymore. And there's no issues with, getting oil fed into the engine because it's all in an external tank. And that sort of thing. So we've had, great reliability to this point now that we've gone with the dry sump. But again, as you saw with the data, there's still some fine tuning, and that comes back, I think, to more configuration, a little bit better cooling, and honestly, engine options at this point. So the last question here, it actually ties into this, is Boost TI Mon. What was the loss of oil pressure caused by? So I'm guessing what you mean here is he's watched the video, the podcast with Harvey, where he went over the data, and you saw that like towards the top, we were getting down into the low, mid 30 psi oil pressure at the very end of the run, where everything is, as hot as it's going to be. Basically, what our suspicion is that it largely ties back to heat, because the oil temps got higher than we wanted them to be. And so the hotter the oil is, the thinner the oil is, so the lower the oil pressure is going to be. That's a big part of it, but I think also there's a secondary effect of what that heat does to the engine block and the engine internals, because the engine is that hot, if not hotter. And when you get up to those high temperatures, then there's things that change with the tolerances inside the engine as well, which can have an impact on oil pressure and such. And I think it all comes back to heat and those factors. And so there again, that's where looking at what we can do with an engine build to set up and pick and build the engine, knowing what this car is doing, to try and optimize the components, the tolerances, and everything like that, versus just using a stock off-the-shelf block. Now, I would say that for 99.9% of us out there that are just driving the car, obviously the stock block works well. The fact that we were able to get the result that we did on a completely stock short block, stock cylinder head, stock cams, the whole nine, says a lot for how reliable it is. But I think what we're starting to see is that there are just some limitations with using all stock components. And a lot of those limitations are not the ones that you would obviously think, like ring lands. I mean, ring lands or bearing failure is what kind of we go to. Those are our top level concerns with the stock short block, which is why I think so many people were asking about, what had failed with these engines. But it's more to see like, okay, well now that we have the data to look at, what are some of the changes that are going on when you're using the car hard and getting the temperatures high, and you're basically stressing the cooling system to its max, both in terms of oil and coolant, to the point where the temperatures of everything in the engine and the engine itself are getting above what a normal level would be. And then there's some issues that come out of that. And so again, I think it's a testament to how reliable the engine can be. But if we're on the right track here and we make some of these changes and we start to see reliability increase because of some of the changes that we're making, then that's going to be the indication that for this kind of environment where there's such a heat load on the engine, that you have to go away from the stock tolerances. And like, I guess the flip side of that, for the majority of us out there that have a street car, track car, whatever, it brings back the emphasis to cooling. You really need to pay attention to what the temperatures are for coolant, for oil, that sort of thing, what your pressures are. But keeping everything cool, keeping the engine at its optimal hot operating temperature and not letting it go above that, I think keeping everything cool is a really big piece of the puzzle if you're going to be tracking your car more and that sort of thing, because you don't want to get into these fringe cases that I think we're running into. And so, yeah, just keeping everything running cool and in an optimal temperature range, that's just such a big piece of the puzzle. And that's what kind of we've been chasing for a long time. It's just, I think we were approaching it more from maybe a surface level, and we actually need to go to engine internals level as well as the supporting mods like radiators and oil coolers and all that sort of thing to really get a handle and get control on the cooling system that we actually need. But for most of us out there, it's really just making sure that the engine is running in an acceptable temperature range, your coolant is in a good range, and your oil especially is in a good temperature range. And then your chances of success are far, far greater, which is, again, like for the first 5 years, stock engine and no changes, and it worked until we did eventually have the bearing failure. So that's what that's the path we're going down. That's where we're exploring, and there's going to be more information on that here in the future. So, yeah, hopefully that's interesting. Hopefully you guys enjoy this episode. We've got a great suggestion for the next one. I'll just spoil it here, because again, by the time this comes out, you'll probably have seen it already, which was questions around rally suspension. So send your questions in through the YouTube channel there. In the next couple of weeks, I'll record that episode, and I'll let you know what we know, and we're just scratching the surface. There's a lot that we don't know, but we've tried a lot of stuff now, and now that we're working with Cusco to develop some of these 03G gravel suspensions, we're learning more, and it's really interesting. It's a different thing. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Thanks for your questions, you guys. These are awesome. I really like going through these, and hopefully you guys enjoy this as well. It's a fun way to record an episode and get more information out there. So thanks so much for your support. Thanks for your question. And until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.